You clicked on this video to answer one question. Should I take a gap year? And if so, should I take one or two? Well, today we're going to answer just that. If you're new here, my name is Michael, and on this corner of the internet, we figure out ways to live happier, more fulfilling pre-med lives. Let's talk about some gap years. I want to make one point clear. Taking a gap year or not should be up to you. It should be an intentional decision that you make on your own terms. I've had far too many friends get to the application cycle, get to the point where they're forced to take a gap year. They're forced to take an additional year off just because their application isn't where they want it to be. Now, because we're friends, I don't want the same thing happening for you. So today, I'll talk about how you can decide whether or not to take a gap year based on whether the extra time will make your application more competitive. And significantly more competitive, that is. That way, you'll be able to decide whether a gap year is truly right for you, and you can make an intentional decision that fits your journey. Now, to be clear, if you're at the point where you're planning to apply to medical school, and your application just isn't where you want it to be, that's okay. There are certainly ways that you can improve your application and you can get ahead of it with time. But of course, if you're a little earlier on in your career and you have the time, energy, and foresight to think about this in advance, your application odds are going to skyrocket. So let's walk through the decision tree on whether you should apply to medical school. First things first, if we assumed you could get in anywhere, would you even want to start medical school? And to be clear, I'll show you when you would start medical school based on when you apply. Here's a timeline outlining exactly just that. Feel free to pause the video, take some time to digest it, and then we'll start the video when you're ready. Okay, back to the decision tree. Assuming you could get in anywhere, would you even want to start medical school at the time you will? Now, if that's a no, then your decision is easy. And to be clear, your reason can be anything. You're burnt out, you need a break, you want to spend some time exploring Europe or Southeast Asia, you want to get away from school before you delve back into it for another 4 years, including 3 to 7 years of residency, or you just want to earn some money and get ahead of the financial burden of medical school. Whatever reason you have here, if it's not related to the competitiveness of your application, it's certainly valid. You can take time away from school for any reason that you see fit. And no one should ever tell you that you wanting to take time off isn't reasonable. Okay, well, the good thing is that that branch of the tree is the shortest branch. It's over. If you answer no, then there's no real point in having this discussion. If you do want to start medical school at that time, you'll also have to figure out if medical schools will want you to start medical school at that time. In other words, you'll have to figure out if you're competitive enough to make your dreams happen. This will be a soft science. Of course, if I could predict your medical school admissions odds and tell you exactly where you're going to end up without you having to apply, then one, I'd probably be much more wealthy than I am now. And two, students probably wouldn't even need to apply to medical school. Most importantly, I could save tens of thousands of medical school applicants from the pain of not getting into a single school every year. But because the decision to take a gap year is heavily intertwined with how competitive your application is, let's talk about that. How to assess whether your application is strong enough to get into medical school. And to do that, well, you're gonna have to know exactly what each and every part of a medical school application is. The bad news is that there's a lot that goes into a medical school application. The good news is that I already have 2 videos going through all of that in great detail. Video number 1 is playing here, and I'll put the link in the description box below, but that covers everything that goes into a medical school application, as well as some of the soft skills that are relevant in optimizing those parts of your application. In video number 2, and I'll put that there, is a full application run through of my friend Ben's actual medical school application. This is the thing he actually submitted to medical schools. And I walk through every single bit of the puzzle just to show you how his entire application came together. Feel free to pause this video, go down in the description box below, right click, open both of those videos in new tabs, watch them, and come back here when you're ready. Let's move forward. And again, to move forward, let's get a quick skeleton of everything that goes onto your medical school application. And that is your GPA, your MCAT, your working activities section, your school list, your letters of recommendation, your personal statement, your secondaries, your interviews, and maybe something like Casper. Now, it's relatively complicated to evaluate something like your GPA and MCAT score. Thankfully, there's some real data from the AAMC that helps you evaluate that. And even more thankfully, I have an exact video on that topic, and you can find that here, titled Your Medical School Chances Are Higher Than You Think. And it's based on GPA and MCAT scores affecting your admissions odds. Click there if you'd like to learn more. Letters of recommendation, of course, are harder to evaluate, and for 99.9% of us, we'll never see what is written on those documents. That lets professors be honest about how they see you. The best help I can offer there is to check out our pre-med home base, the hidden village of pre-meds. I have a full video walkthrough of my own letters of recommendation that can give you a sense of the relationships that I had with my strong letter writers. Moving down the list here, we have extracurricular activities. Make sure you have a foundation of clinical experiences, shadowing, and for most all medical schools in the nation, some sort of research or scholarly work. Past those fundamentals, you'll want to make sure that your extracurriculars are representative of who you are. When you lay everything in front of you, all of your extracurricular activities, are you a pre-med robot?
Not really. I had hoped you would come to think of me as your friend.
Or, truthfully, do those experiences do a good job of expressing who you really are, how you spend your free time? And probably one of the most important things, what you're pretty damn good at. Make sure that those, even if they're not specifically related to medicine, go on your extracurricular profile. You want to make sure that that is really who you are. Personal statements, secondaries, and interviews, of course, are much more subjective, and it's harder to assess that, especially because you haven't gotten to that point yet. I do plan on getting to those videos very soon, and if you'd like to see that series where I break down an effective personal statement, an effective secondary essay, and effective interviews, then please let me know in the comment section below. Based on how many students are interested, I'll make sure to move those topics up the video list. Now that you have everything in front of you, let's make an actual assessment. Let's do an actual evaluation of how strong your application is. Let's go back to the timeline that we built here together. Now remember, when we're making an assessment, we want to decide between two camps. Should I take a gap year or should I take one gap year? Should I take one gap year or should I take two gap years? Should I take no gap years or should I take two gap years? Compare two things at a time just to be clear of what you're getting and what you're losing with each decision. Let's start with your GPA. If you do take a gap year, what will change? I'll give you the exact calculations that I made when I was a junior contemplating whether I should take a year off. But this can be the case if you're a senior, a year out of school, 2 years out of school, whatever it is. And the best part is you don't need a fancy calculator or anything. I'll show you how to calculate your GPA. What you want to do is have a copy of your transcript handy, take the units of the courses you're taking, multiply it with the multiplier that I'm going to leave on the screen here based on your grade, and then you'll get your points. Divide your points by the number of units, and that's your GPA. If you'd like to combine different quarters, you just need to do the same math. I'll give you an example here of my grades in winter of 2019. You can see that I took 4 courses here, each of them worth 4 units, except for my research, which was a multiple term course that was 8 units. You can see that A's and A pluses are both worth 4.0. 4.0 units times the 4.0 multiplier gives me 16 points for my General and Organic Chem Lab 2, or Chem 14CL. And you do the same math all the way down, including for the fact that I got a B+, unfortunately, in my drug abuse neurobiology course, Neuroscience C177, 4.0 units times the 3.3 multiplier for a B+, giving me 13.2. You add all those points together and you get 77.2 points. Divide that by the number of units that I was enrolled in, which in this case was 20 units, and you get your GPA of 3.86. All right, some more quick maths that I think is relevant. Over the 3 2/3 years that I spent at UCLA, because I graduated 1 quarter early, I took exactly 186 total units. That means every year I took about 50 graded units, which makes sense. It's about 16 or 17 graded units every quarter. Let's do the math here now. If you're at your junior year and you've taken 150 units, let's say you're a straight A- student, putting you at a 3.70 GPA. That's 150 units times a 3.7 multiplier divided by 150 units is 3.7 GPA. Let's say senior year will afford you another 50 units. If you get straight A's, what will your new GPA be? Let's do that together. You'd have the 150 units times the 3.7 multiplier for the A minus. You'd also tack on 50 units with a 4.0 A multiplier. You divide that numerator by a total of 200 total units. That gives you a GPA of 3.775. Now, some of you might be surprised by that number. An entire year of straight A's, you can't bring your 3.7 GPA, not even 0.1 to a 3.8? Well, yeah, you can't. And you would have known if you had done the math. Still, 3.7 to a 3.78 is a very strong bump. It gets you much closer from being in the middle of the 46.5% acceptance odd range to the 64.6% acceptance rate group. I explained those numbers in this video here. Your medical school odds are higher than you think. So now you'll have to make the judgment call. Is an entire year, assuming, big assumption here, that you get all A's for 50 units your senior year, is that going to be good enough to make spending an entire year worth it? Some will say yes, I'd love to apply with a 3.78, even if it costs me an entire year. Others will say no, I think 3.7 and 3.78 are pretty much the same, and I'd like to save some time. But that's only 5% of the pre-med population. The other 95% will not have made the assessment that you just did, and they'll be punching in the dark. They'll be making guesses about this or that, and they won't have real numbers and real data to inform their decision. The biggest theme of this video is to evaluate your application, get all the information on the table, and then make your decision. Eliminate the guesswork and act from a position of power. Now, the second thing I wanted to talk about is the strength of your extracurricular activities. Many students will say, I just don't really think I'm strong enough to apply to medical school. I think I'll just take another year. By then, my extracurriculars should be sound. I'll just apply then. Then what happens is they get the whole year. They realize that the only thing that they've done is took their 400 hours of community service and brought it to 500 hours. And they realize that their application looks exactly the same. It's just as weak as it was last year. Remember, not all gap years are made equal. For juniors, their gap year looks different for a senior, and that gap year looks different for someone who's 1 year out of college. Again, let's go to the timeline to explain. Remember, for those of you who are juniors, the gap year isn't the same as others. Your additional year before your application is during school, when you have those 50 units to complete, and you're most likely just doing the same extracurriculars you did last year. Now, does 600 hours of Vietnamese community health look better than 500 hours? Yeah, but truthfully, it's marginal. If your only setback is extracurriculars, evaluate whether that gap year will actually give you what you need. Scratch that. That sentence goes for everything in your application, not just your extracurriculars. The key is, does what you need to improve in your application actually improve with 1 year off? If not, does it improve with 2 years off? Those are the questions that you really have to answer. If they don't truthfully improve, you might as well apply now. Lastly, don't sleep on your letters of recommendation. When you're evaluating your application, make sure that your letters of recommendation are strong and you're ready. Not only do you have a strong GPA and MCAT score, strong extracurriculars, but you get some support from people who aren't you. You get some support from professors and faculty members or any professional that you've had the chance of working with in the last 3 to 4 years. Remember, medical school admissions is holistic. This means that you can get away with a weaker GPA or a weaker MCAT score, but it also does mean that other parts of your application, strong extracurriculars, a strong personal statement, and most importantly here, a strong letter of recommendation, that has to be the thing that uplifts your application. All right, the key word for this entire video is intentionality. You want to be in the driver's seat, making decisions for yourself. Don't be that student who thinks, damn, I wish I thought about my application beforehand. These are things that I knew were coming over the last year or 2 years, and I never sat down to think about them. Don't be that student. Don't be the student that has to accept, man, I have to take a gap year now because my application just has big holes that I haven't addressed. Worst of all, don't be the student who hasn't evaluated their application at all, applies to medical school blindly, and becomes one of the 30,000 other people who don't get into medical school each and every year. To be clear, Staples Center only holds 20,000 people. 1.5 Staples Centers every single year of pre-med students do not get in. And plenty of them don't get in because they haven't evaluated their application. They don't know whether a gap year or 2 gap years or no gap year is right for them. They apply blind and the cookie crumbles the way it does. No matter where you are in your medical school journey, take some time, go quickly through that decision tree, draw out your own timeline so that you intimately understand what's going to happen when, and evaluate your application. Evaluate what your application looks like right now. Evaluate what your application will look like when you plan on applying, and evaluate your application based on another time that you plan on applying, whether that's 1 gap year or 2 gap years or no gap year. See how your applications change, GPA and extracurricular wise and letters of recommendation wise, everything. See how that changes when you take a year, you take 2 years, or you just take no years and go straight through. Remember, there are 2 important questions. What can I expect to improve if I take extra time off? And more importantly, the second question, does that actual improvement make a significant change in my admissions odds? A 3.71 GPA is not different from a 3.7. And 450 hours is not different from 500. These are the judgment calls you can only make when you have everything in front of you. You project what your time will look like, and then you can make an educated decision about what's right for you. If you want to evaluate your application right now, I have a medical school chances quiz. You can put in your GPA, you can put in your MCAT score, and you can put in other things that make up the medical school application. And out will come 2 things. You'll get a grade on how strong your application is, and you'll get a medical school list that I think is appropriate for you at this moment. It's a great tool to estimate how strong your application currently is, where it needs to go, and how to exactly do just that. I'll leave the link to that video in the description box below. The good news is that because you watch this video, you're much more closer to having an accurate estimation of how strong your application truly is. If you need a direct comparison, I have a video here where I go over my friend Ben's application, a 3.8, 517 MCAT superstar who, unfortunately, even after applying to 30 medical schools, didn't get into a single one. It's super useful to compare where your application is with where his is, and I go through the entire app. And of course, because everyone's pre-med situation is different, you're bound to have some additional questions. You can take some of those questions, leave them in the comment section below. Before then, make sure you evaluate your application, figure out your strengths and your weaknesses, and now you'll have a better understanding of whether a gap year or no gap year is the right decision for you to make. Thanks for watching this video, and until next time, take it easy. Dope. Shoot, you're still here? Well, thanks for watching to the end of the video. And second, I was just working on this quiz. It's this medical school chances calculator. You just take a 10-question quiz, and at the end of it, you get your strengths, your weaknesses, and a customized school list. If you want to take it, here's the QR code. I mean, if that didn't work, here's a QR code as well. And then I'll also put the link in the description box below. Well, I'm gonna go back to finishing the quiz, and I'll see you later.